My sister-in-law spent years quietly working to unravel my marriage, thread by thread. And in the end, it was my own husband who said the word divorce first. 3 days later, I didn't hesitate. Not for 1 second. That was the same week a tuition invoice for her son's private school, nearly $6,000 for the spring semester alone, showed up in my inbox, addressed to me like it always was. I let it sit unread that evening. I had dinner to get on the table. I'd been on my feet for almost 2 hours, a beef pot roast braised low and slow until the gravy went thick and glossy, a whole fillet of steamed cod with ginger and scallions, broccoli charred just right in garlic oil, and the sweet and sour chicken that Cody always asked for by name. Cody was my sister-in-law's son. Every time he came over, he'd wrap his arms around my waist and beg, all charm, for that one dish. And every time I made it for him, even though the smell of hot oil that night made my stomach turn in a way I'd never felt before. Something had been different in my body for days. Even the scent of raw fish left me faintly nauseous. I said nothing. I just kept stirring. Around dusk, Whitney let herself in with Cody trailing behind her. She had a way of moving through my house like she'd paid the mortgage on it. Shoes kicked off in the middle of the entryway, straight to the couch, phone out. Some video blasting loud enough that my temples throbbed all the way from the kitchen. Her laugh cut through the noise, high and grating, tangled up with my mother-in-law Barbara's voice at the dining table. Barbara had already found something to complain about. She picked up a napkin, dragged it across a spot on the table that was, as far as I could tell, spotless, and clicked her tongue. "Still a little sticky here." Then, glancing at the floor, Whitney mentioned there was dust in that corner last time she stopped by. There was always dust in some corner, according to Whitney, on days she happened to be visiting. I checked the clock. 5:40. Daniel usually walked in around 6. I dried my hands, arranged the platters, laid the silverware just a little more carefully than usual. I wanted tonight to be ours. After dinner, once things had quieted down, I planned to tell him about the small, stubborn heartbeat the doctor had found at my last appointment. 2 months along. Strong heartbeat, good implantation, everything exactly where it should be. I'd cried in the parking lot afterward, from relief more than anything. 7 years of marriage, and it wasn't that we didn't want a child. It was that hope kept ending in the same quiet disappointment, month after month. This time I wanted one evening, just the two of us, to hold the news before the rest of the world got its hands on it. But Whitney had arrived. She had an uncanny sense for exactly the wrong moment. Or maybe it wasn't luck at all. Every time Daniel and I were about to talk about anything that mattered, money, his mother, a baby, she showed up at the door like clockwork, and whatever quiet we'd built collapsed instantly. The second I set the chicken platter down, Cody reached for a piece. Whitney smacked his hand away with a performance of discipline clearly meant for me. "Wait for your uncle. We have rules at this table." Then she took a wing herself, turned it over, sniffed at it. "Looks a little burnt. Probably drowned in sauce." She smiled without warmth. If I were the one cooking, someone with an actual 6-figure job, we wouldn't be eating like this. I said nothing. I went back to the kitchen for the soup. In that house, the more you explained yourself, the worse it got. Say one sentence and Whitney would twist it into 10. Push back even slightly and she'd start crying about how hard it was to raise a son alone, how nobody understood her sacrifices, and Barbara would leap to defend her daughter while Daniel sat there, silent. His silence, over the years, had come to hurt more than anything either of them ever said out loud. At 6 sharp, the door opened. Daniel walked in. Pressed shirt, hair combed, a faint trace of expensive cologne. He was about to turn 35. Head of the technical division at a mid-sized software company downtown, the kind of job that came with a good salary and an even better reputation. To everyone who knew him, he was a success story, a responsible provider. Barbara told anyone who'd listen how brilliant her son was, and how her daughter, despite a failed marriage, never had to worry about anything because her little brother took care of her. Daniel greeted his mother and sister first. He glanced at me for half a second, then headed for the bathroom to wash up. Whitney followed him instantly, voice suddenly soft and wounded, pouring out every grievance like she'd been saving them up all day. "Daniel, thank God you're home. Your wife's been on another shopping spree. 3 huge boxes delivered this afternoon. Money doesn't grow on trees, you know. Why does she have to be so wasteful?" He came out of the bathroom with his jaw already tight. He looked straight at me. "What did you buy this time?" I almost told him the truth. Prenatal vitamins, loose maternity clothes, a couple of books on pregnancy and newborn care. But Whitney was standing beside him with her arms crossed, and Barbara had lifted her chin, waiting, and the words dissolved in my throat. "Just some things I needed." "What kind of things need 3 boxes?" Whitney laughed. "You sit at home all day, you don't work. Your old house clothes are perfectly fine, stop being so extravagant." I turned and looked her dead in the eye. Maybe it was the life growing inside me, but for the first time in longer than I could remember, I didn't feel like backing down. That money was mine. The table went dead silent. Whitney reacted first, her face darkening. "Did everyone hear that? She eats my brother's food, sleeps under my brother's roof, and has the nerve to talk about her own money. My brother works himself to the bone for this family, and she sits here keeping score of whose dollar is whose." Barbara set her fork down, voice soft but edged like glass. "Claire, honey, don't be so transactional. When you're married, you're a team. There's no such thing as my money and his money. There's only our money. You should be grateful you're in a position to give back to this family." I looked at Daniel, hoping, actually hoping, for one fair sentence. One. That I had never once spent his paycheck on frivolous things. That for years I had covered the daily costs of this household, the tutoring, the school fees, the insurance premiums, every time Whitney showed up with her son in tow needing something. He looked at me instead, with a coldness I hadn't seen before. "If that's how you're going to talk," he said, "maybe we should just get a divorce." I heard the word and, for a second, genuinely thought I'd gone deaf. He said it so lightly, like he was flicking a piece of lint off his shoulder. Beside him, Cody used the distraction to grab a piece of chicken and started eating with both hands. Whitney's mouth twitched into the smallest, fastest smirk. It lasted maybe half a second. I saw it anyway. Barbara kept sorting rice like nothing at all had happened, as if the word divorce was just something that floated through her dining room the way weather did. I stared at the man I had loved for 10 years and been married to for 7. The same man who used to wait outside my dorm at 6 in the morning with warm bread rolls because he knew I skipped breakfast. My family had been dead set against us from the start. Different worlds, they said. My mother was terrified I'd end up hurt, marrying someone from 3 states away with a family she didn't know. I followed him anyway, left a steady job back home, ignored every warning because I believed, with my whole chest, that this man would love me until the end. I set my fork down. My voice came out steadier than I expected, steady enough that it surprised even me. "A divorce, then. So be it." Daniel went pale. Even Whitney lifted her head, startled. I don't think anyone at that table expected me to take the offer that fast. I pulled out my phone, unlocked it, and turned the screen toward Daniel. "Here, look closely." Order after order scrolled past. Prenatal vitamins, a stack of maternity basics, 2 paperbacks on newborn sleep schedules. "I'm 2 months pregnant." The color drained further from his face. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. Whitney recovered first. Impossible. You're lying so he won't leave you. Every time divorce comes up, you play the pregnancy card. Daniel told her, weakly, to be quiet, though I could still hear the doubt underneath it. Barbara's voice came next, soft and cold at the same time. If you're really pregnant, that's wonderful news, but don't use it to back Daniel into a corner. I actually laughed. Through this entire dinner, not one person had asked whether I was tired, whether the baby was healthy, whether I'd seen a doctor. My pregnancy wasn't news to them. It was a bargaining chip, delivered at the worst possible time, and they were already deciding how to use it against me. I slid the phone back into my pocket. I'm not anyone's leverage. Daniel wants a divorce. Fine, I agree. I'll have this baby and raise it myself. Daniel's brow creased. What are you talking about? If we're getting divorced, why would you keep the baby? I already told you. I'll raise the child alone. The room went quiet for one long beat, and then Whitney burst out laughing, sharp and delighted. Wonderful. If you're so brave, go on, crawl back to your parents and raise it there. Just don't you dare come crawling back to this family begging for forgiveness. I didn't argue. I walked straight to the bedroom, pulled the suitcase down from the closet, and packed what actually belonged to me. A few changes of clothes, my passport and personal documents, my prenatal records, a handful of things with any sentimental weight. 7 years of marriage, and it took less than 15 minutes to gather everything in that apartment that was truly mine. When I dragged the suitcase back through the hallway, Whitney was finishing off the last of the chicken. Cody had a soda can in one hand. Barbara was working through the last of her wine, unbothered. Daniel sat on the couch with a cigarette, staring at nothing. Nobody stood up. Nobody said a word to stop me. I paused at the door to put my shoes on, then turned to look at Whitney one more time. You'll regret this. One day. She smirked. Regret losing the person who pays the bills? Go ahead. Try me. I didn't answer. I opened the door and walked out. It wasn't until I was alone in the elevator that I noticed my hands were shaking. Down in the lobby, I called a car to the bus terminal and bought a ticket on the last route out to my hometown, 3 hours upstate, where my parents still lived in the same house I grew up in. On the bus, I texted Daniel. Draw up the divorce papers and send them to me. I'm not fighting you for the apartment. I'll raise this baby on my own. He replied almost instantly. Okay. I stared at that single word for a long moment, then typed one more message. By the way, Cody's tuition for next semester is $15,000. I've been the one covering that for years. It's yours to handle now. 3 minutes later, my phone lit up. What do you mean? I locked the screen and let my head fall back against the seat. Outside the window, the city lights blurred and thinned behind us. Only then did the tears finally come, not because I still hoped for anything, but because I finally understood that for 7 years, what I thought I'd been protecting wasn't a family at all. It was a shelter that only stood as long as my patience held it up. And the moment my patience ran out, I was the one who had to leave it behind. The bus pulled into the small terminal in my hometown close to midnight. It had rained earlier. The asphalt shimmered under the streetlights, and the air outside carried that particular damp chill I remembered from every autumn of my childhood. I dragged my suitcase down the steps and spotted my parents waiting in the thin crowd. Mom had a light cardigan pulled tight around her shoulders, both hands gripping the strap of her purse. Dad stood beside her, back straight as always, though his hair had gone noticeably grayer since my last visit. The second Mom saw me, she rushed over. Her eyes went from the suitcase, to my pale face, to my stomach, like some instinct had already told her everything before I opened my mouth. She didn't ask a single question. She just reached up and cupped my cheek. Her hand warm, but trembling. You're home, sweetheart, I nearly came apart right there on the curb. 7 years as someone's wife, and I'd absorbed more cutting remarks and lectures on wifely patience than I could count. I had forgotten that somewhere in the world, there was still a place where all I had to do was show up, and it wouldn't matter whether I was right or wrong. They would open the door for me regardless. Dad took the suitcase without a word. "Let's get you home, it's late." The drive home wound through streets I knew by heart. The bakery on the corner was dark for the night. The little shop by my old elementary school still had the same faded sign out front. The trees lining our street had grown so tall over the years, their branches now brushed one side of the road. I stared out the window and felt, for the first time in a long while, like someone returning from a very long trip. Long enough that only now, coming back, did I understand that home is the one place in the world where you're allowed to fall apart. Mom sat beside me in the back seat. She started to ask something twice and stopped herself both times. Eventually, she just took my hand and held it. "Did you and Daniel have a fight?" I was quiet for a few seconds. Then, barely above a whisper, "We're getting a divorce, Mom." She drew in a slow breath. Up front, I saw Dad's shoulders go rigid, though he didn't turn around. I kept talking, afraid that if I stopped, I wouldn't find the nerve again. "I'm 2 months pregnant. I want this baby. If Daniel doesn't want it, I'll raise it myself." The car went so quiet I could hear the wipers ticking against the windshield. Mom looked out the window and wiped at the corner of her eye. Dad slowed the car and, in a voice heavier than I'd ever heard from him, said, "Thank God you came home. We'll handle the rest of it together." I put my head down. Tears landed on the back of my own hand. I'd braced myself for scolding, for the old, "we told you so," about marrying a man from 3 states away, for being left to face this alone as some kind of consequence. Instead, neither of them said a single word meant to hurt me further. I don't think I've ever felt more grateful to 2 people in my life. At home, Mom walked me straight to my old bedroom. 7 years, and almost nothing had changed. The same floral curtains, the same desk under the window, the same shelf of college paperbacks I never finished. She'd already made up the bed with clean sheets and left a glass of water and a plate of crackers on the nightstand. She paused in the doorway. "If you want to cry, sweetheart, you can do it tomorrow. If you want to talk, we'll talk. Tonight, just sleep." I nodded. She closed the door softly behind her. I lay in the dark a long time before sleep found me, one hand resting over my stomach, listening to the house settle around me the way it used to when I was 16 and couldn't sleep the night before finals. Somewhere back in the city, Daniel was probably still on that couch. Whitney was probably still gloating. None of it reached me here. For the first time in longer than I could remember, the silence in a room didn't feel like something I had to fill or manage or apologize for. It just felt like rest. My phone had been buzzing since 7 that morning. Whitney first, calling me selfish, saying I ran to my parents at the first sign of trouble, that I'd deliberately humiliated the family by bringing up Cody's tuition in front of everyone. Barbara's message was gentler in tone but somehow sharper in effect. As a wife, you should know how to endure. A woman's strength is measured by whether she can hold a family together. Think about the stress this causes everyone, Claire. Nobody needs an ugly divorce, especially with a baby coming. You're tearing this family apart over money. I read it twice, then locked the screen. The old version of me would have called back and apologized for something I hadn't done wrong. But that morning, sitting in my parents' kitchen while Dad hosed down the porch and Mom picked through a bag of green beans, I realized those words no longer had any grip on me at all. Around 9, a courier called to say a document had arrived from the city. I went down to sign for it. The envelope had Daniel's name printed neatly in the corner. Inside was a draft waiver of rights and a proposed separation agreement, meant for me to sign before he even filed. The longer I read, the colder I felt. He wanted me to leave the apartment voluntarily, waive any claim to property acquired during our marriage, forgo any request for spousal support, and never bring up a single dollar I'd spent over the years. As for the baby, there was one deliberately vague line: both parties will discuss this matter at a later date. I actually smiled, and it wasn't a happy one. Last night he'd thrown out the word divorce in a fit of temper. By this morning he'd already had paperwork drawn up, like he'd been waiting for the right excuse for a long time. I brought the papers inside. Dad's face went dark reading them. Mom set a glass down on the table hard enough to rattle the silverware. "What does he think you are, Claire?" Claire, the name my parents gave me, hoping I'd grow into someone dignified, educated, and fair. I'd spent so many years being the picture of proper conduct that people had started assuming I couldn't feel anything at all. That same afternoon, I met with a lawyer, a woman named Sandra Reyes, mid-40s, small in stature but with a gaze that missed nothing. She read through the draft, then looked up at me. "Your husband drafted this to make sure you walk away with nothing. But the law doesn't run on one person's greed. He's trying to talk you into signing away rights you don't even realize you have." She explained that since we'd never signed a prenup, our state's equitable distribution laws applied to anything acquired during the marriage. More than that, I had every right to recover money I'd spent from my own premarital savings on his family's obligations, along with a fair share of whatever that spending had helped preserve or grow. And when it came to the baby, child support wasn't optional. It was his legal obligation, and I had no right to sign that away out of pride, even if I wanted to. I lowered my head. "I just want this to be over. I don't want anything left connecting us." Ms. Reyes's voice softened. "Because you want it over quickly, everything has to be airtight now. Being decent doesn't mean letting someone take what's rightfully yours. You've already given enough. It's time to protect yourself and your child." I sat with that for a moment. Then I reached into my bag and pulled out a flash drive and a thick stack of printed pages. 3 years of quiet documentation. Receipts for Cody's tuition. Payment confirmations for Whitney's health insurance. Bank transfers to Barbara, month after month. Screenshots of Whitney borrowing money she never repaid, and one message in particular, where she'd told me my savings would just sit there rotting if I didn't spend them on the family. Ms. Reyes flipped through the pages, something like surprise flickering across her face. "How long have you been keeping this?" "Since the first time Whitney told Daniel I was just a freeloader in his family. I wasn't planning to sue anyone. I just wanted proof, in case he ever actually listened, that I wasn't who they said I was." She looked at me for a long moment. "Then we'll use every bit of this. Not for revenge, to put things back where they belong." Leaving her office that evening, I got a call from Daniel. I let it go to voicemail. He called again, then texted. "What are we doing about Cody's school payment?" "The administration sent a notice to my office. Don't put me in this position." I stood under a row of blooming trees outside, watching petals drift down onto the sidewalk, and typed back. "From now on, your nephew's tuition is your family's responsibility." I paid it out of goodwill, as family. That goodwill is gone. He didn't reply right away. Maybe he was doing the math. Maybe, for the first time, he was looking at a real number. Tens of thousands of dollars. And realizing that what he'd always assumed was simply handled had actually been built on years of my own money, quietly disappearing. That night, Mom brought a glass of warm milk to my room and sat on the edge of the bed, stroking my hair the way she used to when I was small. "Claire, I'm not scared of you getting a divorce. What scares me is you staying miserable because you're afraid of what people will say." I leaned into her shoulder. For the first time in years, I didn't feel alone in a decision. Somewhere back in the city, Daniel was probably furious. Whitney was probably telling anyone who'd listen how ungrateful I was. Barbara was probably complaining to relatives about my shamelessness. But here, in this small room, my mother sat beside me, my father quietly handled whatever needed handling, and the child inside me reminded me, without a single word, that my life didn't end because of one bad marriage. I didn't sleep right away. I lay staring at the ceiling, at a hairline crack that had been there since high school, and felt strangely lighter, not because anything had actually been resolved, but because I no longer had to work at being liked by people who never planned to like me back. My phone buzzed twice against the nightstand. I already knew who it was. Daniel called twice more, then gave up, and one message came through instead. No need to blow this out of proportion. We can talk about everything. I stared at those words a long time. In the past, we can talk always meant I would talk, and he would listen just enough to keep believing whoever had gotten to him last. Now that I had nothing left to say, suddenly he wanted to talk. Some things arrived too late for any conversation to matter. I didn't respond. I turned my phone face down and rested my hand over my stomach. No kicking yet, just presence. A steady, quiet thread pulling me back into the world. "Mom's not going to let you live like that," I whispered, mostly to myself. The next morning, Dad drove me back to Ms. Reyes's office. She'd already prepared our response to the divorce filing and walked me through every point, where my rights stood and where Daniel's obligations stood. Obligations he wasn't going to be able to talk his way around. "You have to hold your ground," she said, calm and certain. "This isn't about taking what's not yours. It's about a fair split. You're not stealing his property. You're recovering your share." I nodded, but the words landed harder to accept than they sounded. 7 years of stepping back, of believing a family shouldn't run on petty math. But it turned out that because I never counted, everyone else had simply assumed it was theirs to take. Ms. Reyes opened her laptop and pulled up the full list of expenses I'd handed her. Each figure appeared cold and clinical on the screen, and yet my heart still sped up looking at them. Cody's yearly tuition, monthly transfers to Barbara, Whitney's insurance premiums, groceries, apartment repairs, medical bills, a total I had genuinely never sat down and calculated. Over $40,000 of my own money, across 7 years, while I had almost no income of my own the entire time. All of it traced back to savings I'd built before I ever got married. That, she said, was our strongest argument. I stared at the number and watched every memory play back at once. Cody's first day of school, Whitney crying that she couldn't afford the deposit, Barbara's back pain, needing money for acupuncture, Daniel insisting we save aggressively for the mortgage, which somehow always meant I dipped into my own account instead of touching his. At the time, every one of those moments had felt like ordinary duty. It never occurred to me that one day it would become the clearest evidence of exactly how unfairly I'd been treated. That afternoon, my phone rang again. Daniel's name lit up the screen. I hesitated, then answered. "Where are you?" he asked. His voice was softer than the day before. "At my parents' house. I need to talk to you." "Go ahead." Silence on the other end, then a sigh. "It's about Cody's school. Can you help me just this one last time? You always handled it. You can't just drop it overnight. Whitney can't come up with that kind of money." I let out a small, joyless laugh. "Daniel, let me ask you something. In 7 years, did you ever once ask where the money for Cody's education actually came from?" He went quiet. "You just knew it was handled and assumed that was my job. Now that I've stopped, suddenly you feel the weight of it." "It's not that I didn't know," he said, quieter now. "I just thought of it as a family matter." "Right. A family matter. And I was part of that family too. When Whitney called me a freeloader, You were silent. When your mother called me wasteful, you were silent. The second I said the word mine, you asked for a divorce. More silence. I didn't wait for him to fill it. Cody's tuition is between the two of you now. He's your nephew, not my responsibility. I hung up before he could answer. My hands trembled slightly, but my mind felt clearer than it had in years. Maybe once a person finally says the thing they've swallowed for a decade, the fear that used to come with it simply stops showing up. That same day, Mom took me to the grocery store. She picked through every item like it mattered. Fresh vegetables, a carton of milk, a couple of soft loungewear sets for my growing belly. Every time she looked at me, her eyes went a little warmer, like she was trying to make up, in small gestures. For years, she hadn't been close by. "Are you planning to stay here for good?" she asked. "Yes, Mom. I'll have the baby here." She nodded and didn't push for more, though I could tell she was turning something over in her mind, holding back so she wouldn't add pressure. Her worry showed up instead in 100 small kindnesses. That night, Dad called me into the living room and set a small savings passbook on the table in front of me. "Your mother and I opened this account for you when you got married. We wanted to give it to you then, but you wouldn't take it. Take it now." I stared at it. "Dad, I don't need it. I still have my own money." He shook his head. "It isn't just for you. It's for the baby too. Your mother and I are getting older. We can't do much for you anymore, but at least you'll have something to fall back on." I took the passbook with trembling hands. For the first time since all this started, I understood clearly that I hadn't lost everything. I'd lost my marriage. I still had my family, a child growing inside me, and, somewhere underneath all of it, myself. Lying in bed that night, listening to the wind move through the trees outside, my phone lit up again. Not Daniel this time, but an unfamiliar number. It was Whitney, texting from a number I didn't recognize. "You left for your parents' house without even telling me. That's a little much, don't you think?" I read it and didn't reply. A second message followed almost immediately. "You think a divorce solves everything? You think you've won? You're still a daughter-in-law in this family, whether you like it or not." I looked at the screen and turned the phone off. Some people, even after you've walked out of their lives, keep tugging on invisible threads to pull you back in. This time, I wasn't going to let them. I set my hand over my stomach and closed my eyes. There was still a great deal ahead of me. Hard days, confrontations I couldn't avoid. But for the first time, I had chosen to be on my own side, and I wasn't going to look back from it. The days that followed didn't bring the blow-up I half expected. No one showed up at the house to make a scene. No shouting matches. No dramatic confrontations. Everything happened in a kind of eerie quiet, and that silence taught me something. Once a person's affection for you has gone cold, everything can collapse without a single raised voice. I settled into a rhythm at my parents' place. Mornings with Mom at the farmer's market, choosing vegetables and fish, afternoons helping her cook, evenings in my room, reading or jotting down notes for the baby's arrival. Things that once bored me now gave me a kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. My belly had started to round out, just slightly, and every time I caught the change in the mirror, something in my chest settled a little more. This baby kept growing, blissfully unaware of any of the noise around it, unaware its parents were separating, unaware of every argument happening somewhere out of its reach. All it knew was that it depended on me. That thought alone made me want to be stronger. One afternoon, while I sat calculating rough expenses for the months ahead, Dad called me into the living room. A thick envelope sat on the table, my name written across the front in Daniel's handwriting. "More documents, probably," Dad said evenly. Inside wasn't a revised version of the earlier agreement. It was a formal folder from a law firm Daniel had hired. The core demands were the same, but now there was an added clause. If I deliberately delayed proceedings or pursued what they called unreasonable property claims, his side reserved the right to file a countersuit. I stopped reading, not out of shock, but because I could finally see Daniel clearly for what he'd become. He was no longer the man who used to wait under my window at dawn. He was someone bracing to defend his own interests by any means necessary, even if that meant treating me as an adversary. Mom scanned a few pages over my shoulder and shook her head. "He's trying to scare you, honey." Dad was quiet, then said, "The harder he pushes, the more we stick to the law. They won't leave you with nothing." I brought the folder back to Ms. Reyes the next day. She read through it carefully and set it down. "He's trying to pressure you emotionally," she said, and then explained, calmly, exactly how we'd respond, point by point, so none of it would stick. That afternoon, an unfamiliar number called again, an older woman's voice this time. "Is this Claire?" "Yes, speaking." "This is Daniel's aunt. I don't want to get in the middle of anything, but I heard you took this to court. That doesn't seem right at all. A husband and wife should work things out privately. Once you air it all in public, there's no coming back from that." I answered as evenly as I could. "I understand, Aunt Diane, but some problems, if they're never named, never end. You, of all people, should understand that. Daniel has a temper sometimes, but he isn't a bad person. What you're doing is embarrassing him." I felt a familiar ache settle in, the same one I'd carried for 7 years, always managing my own feelings so I wouldn't damage someone else's reputation. "I've tolerated a great deal, Aunt Diane, but now I want to live for myself, and for my child." There was a pause. "You've changed," she finally said. "Yes. If I hadn't, I wouldn't be myself anymore." The call ended. I set the phone down and noticed, almost with surprise, that my chest wasn't tight the way it used to get after conversations like that. Maybe once a person finally speaks their own mind out loud, other people's opinions stop having quite as much power over them. That same day, Ms. Reyes called me in. A new stack of paperwork sat waiting on her desk. "The other side filed additional material," she said. "They're arguing that most of the family's expenses came from Daniel's income, and that you were simply managing money he earned, not actually contributing anything of your own." I wasn't surprised. It was exactly the argument I expected Daniel's lawyers to reach for. "What do you think?" I asked. "Our evidence is stronger. Every transfer you made is documented. The major expenses are traceable to accounts in your name, and most importantly, we can show the funds originated from savings you had before the marriage." She paused. "There's one more thing. They intend to request a DNA test once the baby is born." I felt my jaw tighten. "They're not actually doubting it," she said gently. "It's a delay tactic and a pressure tactic. But you have nothing to be afraid of. If it comes to that, we'll go through the process, and it will only strengthen your position." I took a breath. "I'm not afraid." She smiled slightly. "I know." Leaving her office, I walked for a long while before calling a car home. The evening air had that particular late fall coolness that always used to mean the leaves were about to turn. I walked slowly, one hand resting under my stomach, running through everything still ahead. The trial wouldn't be easy. There would be more hurtful words, more surprises I couldn't plan for. But I understood, somewhere in my gut, that I'd already crossed the halfway point of something. At dinner, Dad mentioned the mediation hearing was scheduled for the following week. Mom looked at me with quiet worry but said nothing. She just piled more food onto my plate. "Eat well, honey. You'll need the strength." "I'm fine, Mom," I told her, and I mostly meant it. Dad set down his spoon. "Whatever happens, you don't stop halfway." I understood he wasn't only talking about the court case. "I know, Dad." That night, I sat by the window a long time, watching the streetlights come on one by one, remembering all those evenings early in my marriage when I'd sit exactly like this waiting for Daniel to come home, hoping tonight would be the night he finally understood me better. Now I sat here thinking about myself instead, and the child who would arrive whether or not anyone else in that old life ever came around. My phone buzzed. A text from Daniel. Trials next week. Be ready. I answered simply, I know. He didn't write back. I turned the phone off and set it aside. Some conversations, no matter how long they run, change absolutely nothing. What matters in the end isn't who talked the loudest, it's who's still standing when it's over. On the morning of the mediation hearing, Dad drove me into the city without much conversation. Just before I got out of the car, he said only, "Stay calm." I nodded, took a breath, and walked in. The mediation room was small. A long table, a handful of chairs, a window overlooking a parking lot. I arrived 5 minutes early. My hands had gone cold, though my pulse stayed steady. A few minutes later, Daniel walked in wearing a crisp white shirt, looking put together but tired around the eyes. Whitney and Barbara came in behind him. Whitney sneered softly the moment she saw me. Barbara just glanced my way and looked elsewhere. Daniel sat across from me and studied my face for a few seconds before looking away. "You've lost weight," he said quietly. I didn't answer. Some things, said at the wrong time, lose all their meaning no matter how sincere they might be. The mediator read through both petitions and each side's demands. When it was Daniel's lawyer's turn, he spoke in a flat, formal tone. "My client leaves the question of the marriage itself to the court. But regarding property, we believe the vast majority was earned through my client's income, and we strongly object to an even split." I listened without surprise. This was exactly what I'd prepared for. The mediator turned to me. "What's your position?" I kept my eyes forward, my voice level. "I'm not pursuing anything Daniel acquired before our marriage, but for assets built during the marriage, I'm asking for a division consistent with the law." Whitney cut in, voice rising. "You've got some nerve. You sat at home not earning a cent and now you want half his assets?" The mediator called for order. She kept going anyway. "Tell the truth. You ran to your parents and filed a lawsuit. Who's going to want you now, with a baby in tow?" I looked at her, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel a flicker of anger. I just saw everything clearly, the way you see a familiar room once the lights come on. "Whitney, you don't need to worry about that. I can take care of myself." The room tightened. Daniel's brow furrowed. "Claire, don't talk like that. I'm just telling the truth." The mediator moved to the question of child support. Daniel hesitated. "We can discuss that another time." I shook my head. "There's no reason to wait. I'm having this baby and I'm raising him. You have a legal obligation to pay support." Whitney laughed bitterly. "You talk like you're 100% sure whose baby it is." The room went completely silent. I held her gaze without blinking. "Whitney, you should be more careful with your words." Daniel turned to his sister, voice low but firm. "That's enough." It was the first time in the entire meeting he'd defended me against her, and I felt absolutely nothing. If he'd said that same sentence years ago, this whole story might have gone differently. The hearing ran nearly an hour and ended with no agreement. The mediator ruled that the matter would proceed to a formal trial. Standing up to leave, I felt something like relief. Not because anything had been resolved, but because I hadn't backed down from a single thing. In the hallway, Daniel caught up to me. "Claire, I want to talk to you, seriously." I checked my watch and nodded. We found a quiet corner. "Do you really want to take this all the way to trial?" he asked. "I already have." He fell quiet, then said softer, "I didn't expect it to turn out like this." Something strange moved through my chest. Not resentment, not leftover love, just a kind of distant clarity. How did you expect it to turn out? He had no answer. Maybe we can just let the money go. He tried again. Separate amicably. I shook my head slowly. I let it go for 7 years. That's enough letting go. That sentence wasn't said loudly, but it was enough to end the conversation. I turned and walked away, and this time I didn't hear him call after me. Outside, Dad was waiting by the car. He didn't ask anything, just studied my face to make sure I was all right. "It went fine, Dad," I told him, and he nodded and opened the door. On the drive home, I watched the city pass by, unchanged, everyone rushing along exactly as they always did. Nothing out there had shifted at all. Only I had. I rested a hand on my stomach and closed my eyes. This wasn't over. But I wasn't afraid of it anymore either. After the failed mediation, everything shifted into a colder, clearer phase. There was no more room for niceties or face-saving gestures. What remained were filings, deadlines, and a growing stack of documents. I understood, somewhere in that stretch of weeks, that once a marriage lands in court, it stops being a story about two people and becomes a case, weighed on facts instead of feelings. While we waited for the trial date, I heard almost nothing from Daniel. That silence told me he was handling things his own way, consulting his attorneys, preparing his arguments, maybe just convincing himself he was in the right. Meanwhile, I kept to a steady rhythm. Morning walks for fresh air per doctor's orders. Mom often joined me, filling the quiet with stories about the neighbors or memories from my childhood. Small conversations that worked on me like a warm cloth on a bruise, gently pulling me further from the wreckage I'd left behind. One morning, I answered an unknown number and heard an older woman's voice. "May I speak with Claire?" "Speaking." "This is Daniel's aunt. I don't want to get involved in your business, but I heard you took this to court. That's not right. A husband and wife should settle things privately. Airing your problems out like this, neither of you can look each other in the eye afterward." I answered as calmly as I could. "I understand, but some problems, left unresolved, never actually end. You should understand that too, as a woman. Daniel has a temper sometimes, but he's not a bad man. What you're doing is humiliating him." I felt that same old ache, the years spent protecting a husband's reputation and his family's pride at the expense of my own feelings. "I've tolerated plenty already," I said, firm but not unkind. "Now I want to live for myself and my child." Silence, then softly. "You've changed." "Yes. If I hadn't, I wouldn't be myself." I hung up feeling lighter than I expected. Later that same day, Miss Reyes called me in. New material had come in from the other side, the same claim as before, that most family spending had come from Daniel's earnings, and that I'd merely administered his money rather than contributed my own. I wasn't surprised. "What do you think?" I asked. "Our case is stronger. Every transfer traces back to you, and the funds trace back to savings you had before you married him." She paused. "One more thing. They plan to request a DNA test once the baby's born." I frowned. "They're not truly doubting it," she said. "It's a pressure tactic, meant to cost you time and nerve. You have nothing to worry about. We'll go through it if we have to." "I'm not afraid," I told her, and she smiled, like she'd already known that. At dinner that night, Dad said the first trial was scheduled for the following week. Mom watched me with quiet concern, piling extra food onto my plate without a word. "Eat well, honey. You'll need it." Dad set his spoon down. "Whatever happens, don't give up halfway." "I know, Dad," I said, and understood he wasn't only talking about the courtroom. That night, I sat by the window a long time, watching the street empty out. remembering all the evenings early in my marriage spent waiting for Daniel to come home, hoping each time that tonight would be the night things got better between us. Now I sat in this same kind of quiet, thinking only of myself, and the child who would exist whether or not anyone from that old life ever came around to deserving either of us. On the morning of the trial, I woke earlier than usual, not from nerves exactly, but from the strange sensation of standing in front of a gate I had to walk through, no matter what waited on the other side. I sat at the mirror and chose a loose, calm-colored dress and pinned my hair back simply. Mom stood behind me and said softly, "Just be calm today. Tell the truth. That's all you need." I nodded. I think the word truth had never mattered to me quite this much before. I didn't need to embellish or explain at length. I just needed to say what actually happened and let the court decide the rest. Dad drove me in mostly silent, only reminding me to eat something before we left. I understood his quiet wasn't a lack of concern. He knew I needed the stillness to think. Inside, the courtroom felt colder and more formal than the mediation room had. Everything had to be laid out clearly now. There was no space left for emotion to do any of the talking. When it came to our turn, Ms. Reyes stood. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried. My client, over 7 years of marriage, not only carried the full weight of household responsibilities, but also used her own personal funds to cover a substantial share of the family's expenses. We have documentation for every payment. We ask the court to weigh her financial contribution fully in the division of marital assets. She handed over copies of the bank statements. I looked at those numbers without much feeling left in me. What I once gave freely now had to be examined under a fluorescent light, argued over like a contract dispute, and somehow that no longer stung the way I'd expected it to. Daniel's attorney rose next and spoke at length, arguing the bulk of the household's income had always come from Daniel, and that whatever I'd spent had been done voluntarily, as a manager of funds, rather than a contributor. I listened without interrupting. In a courtroom, everyone has their own version of events. What actually counts is who has the paper to back it up. When the judge called on me directly, I stood. My voice held. During our marriage, I didn't have a stable income of my own, because I left my job to move across the state with my husband. But I had personal savings from before the marriage, and a significant portion of our household expenses came directly from that money. I'm not disputing my husband's income. I am disputing the idea that everything I contributed should simply be erased. Silence followed. I didn't look at Daniel, though I could feel his eyes on me the entire time. When the subject turned to the baby, the air in the room changed. The judge asked about child support. Daniel hesitated. I'm not refusing responsibility, but I'd like confirmation once the child is born. I'd already braced for this, exactly as Ms. Reyes warned me I would need to. I understand, I said. I'll follow whatever legal process is required. If testing is necessary, I'll go through it. That answer settled the room in a way nothing else had. The trial ran longer than expected, and when the judge called a recess to review further evidence, I felt completely drained. Whether from the hours on my feet or the tension of the day, I couldn't say. Outside, Dad was waiting. You okay, honey? I'm fine, Dad. Ms. Reyes fell into step beside me. You did everything you could today. Let the court do its part now. I thanked her, my chest a little lighter. Just then, Daniel came out of the courtroom, hesitated a few steps away, then approached. Claire, 1 minute. I glanced at Dad. He nodded slightly, and I stepped aside. You didn't have to take it this far, Daniel said. And where, in your opinion, was the limit supposed to be? He had no answer. Maybe he genuinely didn't know. Maybe he simply assumed that if I'd compromised just a little more, everything would have stayed easy for him. I compromised for 7 years, I said. Not an accusation, just a fact. but it took away any ground he had left to argue from. "I didn't realize how much you were carrying," he said finally. "It's not that you didn't realize, you just didn't want to know." He went quiet, something dimming behind his eyes. I didn't say anything else. I walked back to Dad, and we left. On the ride home, I barely spoke, watching the same streets pass by with a different set of eyes than I'd had that morning. At home, Mom asked how it went. I told her everything. When I finished, she said only, "So you've cleared another stage." I had. Not because of my patience this time, but because of my own decision to stand there and say what was true. After the first trial, life didn't snap back to normal right away, but the tension eased, the way the surface of water settles after a wave passes even while a current keeps moving underneath. I got used to the new rhythm. Weekly calls with Ms. Reyes to go over the case, hours spent together reviewing bank statements line by line. I didn't feel tired anymore. I was too focused for tiredness to catch up with me. Maybe once you know exactly what you're fighting for, even exhaustion starts to feel purposeful. One evening, a longer message than usual came in from Daniel. "Claire, I've gone back through all the documents. I understand you spent more than I realized, but I can't agree to a 50-50 split. I still want us to reach an agreement so this doesn't drag out in court." I read it, set the phone down, and didn't answer right away. I gave myself time to think it through, not out of doubt, but to make sure whatever I decided wasn't just a reaction to the moment. That night, I told my parents about the message. Mom sighed. "Only now does he understand how much you spent, and he still won't take responsibility." Dad thought for a moment. "It's not that he doesn't understand. He's just calculating what benefits him most." Something clicked into place hearing that. For years, whenever a problem came up, I let my feelings drive the decision. I believed if I was generous enough, people would eventually appreciate it. Some people do. Others take the path that only ever serves them, no matter who it costs. I picked up my phone and answered Daniel plainly. "You had your chance to negotiate before I filed. Everything is under the law now. I'm not changing my position." Sending it, I felt an unexpected sense of calm settle over me, not one shred of second-guessing. The next day, I went in for a regular prenatal checkup. The doctor said the baby was developing well, every indicator normal. Looking at the little shape on the ultrasound screen, I smiled. In the middle of all this chaos, this baby just kept growing, day after day, living in its own small world completely untouched by any of it. Leaving the clinic, I stopped at a coffee shop near downtown, found my usual corner, ordered something warm, and opened the little notebook I'd started keeping since coming home. Writing things down had become less about remembering and more about understanding myself better, one page at a time. I heard a familiar voice while I was writing and looked up to find Ryan, an old friend from high school, standing there. Same easy smile, same tall, lanky frame, though something in his eyes had settled into something steadier since I'd last seen him. "Claire." "Ryan, it's been a long time." He pulled out the chair across from me and sat. After the usual small talk, he looked at me directly. "I heard about everything." I wasn't surprised. News like that always finds its way around eventually, even without anyone saying it out loud. "I'm okay," I told him. "I believe you're okay. I just don't think everyone could handle what you've been through." I gave him a small, tired smile. "It's not really about strength. I just didn't have another option." He was quiet for a moment, then said something I didn't expect. "I think you're wrong about that. You had plenty of other options. You just chose the harder, honest one instead." I didn't know how to answer that, so I just let it sit there between us. And for the first time in weeks, the silence felt easy instead of heavy. Ryan and I started running into each other more after that. Not by any obvious design, just often enough that it stopped feeling like coincidence. He worked in agricultural supply now, running a small distribution operation that connected local farms with restaurants and specialty grocers around the county. He'd tell me about it sometimes over coffee, and I found myself genuinely curious about all of it, the logistics of it, the relationships he'd built with growers over the years. Meanwhile, the legal process kept grinding forward at its own pace. Daniel's team filed one more round of objections, then a formal counteroffer that inched closer, though still not close enough, to what the law actually entitled me to. Ms. Reyes fielded each one with the same even patience. "They're testing how firm you'll stay," she told me one afternoon. "Every round they soften a little. That tells me they know where this ends." Where it ended, 3 months later, was a courtroom I'd learned to walk into without my hands shaking. The final ruling split our marital assets according to the law, with an additional sum awarded to reimburse a portion of what I'd proven came from my own premarital savings. Daniel was ordered to pay child support in line with state guidelines, adjusted once the baby arrived, with no further conditions attached. When the judge read the decision, I felt something in my chest finally unclench. Not triumph exactly, just the quiet, physical relief of a fight actually ending. Outside the courthouse, Daniel found me one last time. He looked older than his 35 years in that moment. "I hope you and the baby are okay," he said. "We will be." He nodded, like he understood there was nothing left to add, and walked away. I didn't watch him go. I found Dad waiting by the car instead, and let that be the last image of that chapter. My father, patient as always, holding the door open for me. With the divorce final, I had to figure out what came next, and for the first time in years, that question didn't feel like a threat. It felt like an actual choice. I'd worked in accounting years before I married Daniel and moved for his job, but going back to spreadsheets and quarterly filings held no appeal for me now. I wanted something that felt like mine from the ground up. One morning over breakfast, I told my parents, "I want to start a small business. Home-cooked meals made to order and catering for smaller events." Mom looked a little surprised. Dad just asked, "Have you thought it through?" "Not in detail yet. But I don't want to just sit here and wait for things to happen to me anymore." Dad didn't object. He just offered one piece of advice. "If you start something, finish it. Don't leave it halfway." In the weeks that followed, I researched suppliers, priced out ingredients, mapped out what a reasonable weekly menu could look like for a small operation run, mostly out of a rented kitchen space. I moved slowly, but with a kind of certainty I hadn't felt in a long time. Ryan showed up throughout all of it, not to take over, but to help where he could. Sometimes he'd just check in to see how things were going. Sometimes he'd send me contacts for organic produce suppliers he trusted. One afternoon, while we stood looking at a small storefront space near the market that might work for the business, he asked, "Aren't you scared?" "Of what?" "Of failing." I thought about it honestly. Of course I'm scared. But if I don't try, I'll be even more scared than that. He nodded like that answer made complete sense to him, which somehow made it easier to believe myself. By my 7th month, my belly had gotten large enough that bending over a stove for hours took real effort, but I kept pushing through the preparations anyway. Dad drove me back and forth to the rented kitchen space every day. Mom reminded me constantly not to overdo it, though she never once told me to stop. One night, Daniel called again. This time, I answered. He asked how I was doing, whether I needed help getting the business off the ground. "That question's a little late," I told him. "I don't need it." He was quiet, then said, "I know my words don't carry much weight anymore, but I am sorry." I didn't argue, and I didn't forgive him out loud either. I just said, "Okay." The call ended shortly after, with him asking me to take care of my health. I hung up and noticed, almost with surprise, that my heart hadn't skipped a single beat through any of it. It really was over, in every sense that mattered. A few weeks later, the business was finally ready to open. I didn't throw any kind of big event for it, just family and a handful of close friends. Mom made a celebratory dish for the occasion, Dad hung the sign out front himself, and Ryan came early to help set everything up. "It looks great," he said, stepping back to admire the little space. That night, after everyone had gone home, I sat alone in my new shop. The warm yellow light from the fixtures filled the small room. I put a hand on my stomach and whispered, "Mommy did it, sweetheart." In answer, I felt a small kick against my palm, and something in me went warm all the way through. The road ahead was still long, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid of it, because I finally knew I had the strength to walk it. Some nights, in that stretch between the trial ending and the baby coming, I'd catch myself back in the past without meaning to go there. The way you don't decide to remember something, it just arrives. I met Daniel my sophomore year of college, in a shared statistics class neither of us particularly wanted to be in. He sat 2 rows behind me and, for reasons I never fully understood until much later, decided the best way to get my attention was to borrow a pencil from me every single class for an entire semester, despite clearly owning several of his own. It was a dumb, small thing, and it worked anyway. By October, we were splitting coffee at the campus cafe that stayed open past midnight during finals. By December, he was walking me back to my dorm in the cold because he said he didn't like the idea of me crossing the quad alone at night, even though the campus had never once had an incident worth worrying about. He wasn't from money, not exactly, but his family had more of a foothold in the world than mine did. A mother who volunteered on committees, a father who'd since passed but had run a small insurance agency, a sister already married and settled by the time Daniel and I started dating. My own family ran a hardware store 2 counties over, the kind of place where my father still swept the floor himself most nights. When I brought Daniel home the first time, my mother was polite. My father was quieter than usual. Neither of them said it outright, but I understood the shape of their worry, that a man from a family like his might, without ever meaning to, end up looking down on a life like ours. I didn't listen. I was 20, and he used to show up at 6 in the morning outside my dorm with a paper bag of warm rolls from the bakery 3 blocks away, just because he'd noticed once, in passing, that I always skipped breakfast before early classes. Nobody had ever paid that kind of attention to me before. It felt, at the time, like being chosen. We got married 4 years later, the June after I finished my accounting degree. My parents came to the wedding and smiled through all of it, though I caught my mother wiping her eyes more than once in a way that wasn't only happiness. I moved 3 states away for Daniel's job. I left a steady position at a regional accounting firm that had already offered me a path toward partner one day, and I didn't think twice about it, because Daniel was building something too, and I believed, the way you believe things at 24, that we were building it together. The first year was, if I'm honest with myself now, genuinely good. We ate out most weekends. He never once forgot a birthday or an anniversary, always came home with something small and thoughtful. Whenever we visited my parents, he never showed up empty-handed. My mother started to relax around him. My father still kept a certain reserve, but even he began to soften, slowly, the way he softened around most things given enough time. It's strange, looking back, to pinpoint exactly where the shift happened, because it never happened all at once. It happened in installments, so gradual that by the time I noticed, I'd already adjusted to each new version of normal without registering that normal had moved at all. The shift, if I have to name a single hinge point, was the year Whitney's marriage fell apart. She'd been caught having an affair. The details never stayed consistent depending on who told the story, but the outcome was the same. Her husband found out, and within a month he'd filed for divorce and asked her to leave. She lost her job not long after. Something about restructuring, though I never got the full story on that either. She showed up at our apartment with 2 suitcases and Cody, then 5 years old, and asked if she could stay for a few months while she got back on her feet. I said yes. Of course I said yes. She was Daniel's sister, going through something genuinely hard, and I remembered enough of my own upbringing to know you don't turn away family in a crisis. A few months became a year. A year became something closer to permanent, an arrangement nobody ever formally renegotiated. It just kept extending itself by default, the way water finds the lowest point in a room and stays there. Whitney never really looked for another job with any urgency. Barbara, who'd always lived close by and treated our apartment as an extension of her own home, started coming around more often to check on her daughter, and somewhere in that overlap, the two of them found a rhythm of complaining about me that fed on itself. It started small. A comment here about how I ran the household. A remark there about how I dressed, how I cooked, how I spent my time during the day since I worked from home doing part-time bookkeeping for a few small local clients. Then it became more pointed, that I looked down on Daniel's family, the real cost, that it can be worn down instead. The way water erodes stone, not through any single blow, but through years of the same small pressure applied in the same place. Through all of it, one person from my old life never let go of the thread connecting us. Nora, my roommate from college, who'd stayed in the city after graduation and built a career in marketing, while I'd moved away to build a life that, in hindsight, was never entirely mine to build. Nora called every couple of weeks, sometimes more, usually just to talk about nothing in particular. Her job, a bad date, a show she was watching. But she had a way of noticing things I never said outright. About 2 years before everything finally broke, she asked me point blank during one of those calls, "Why does it sound like you're always apologizing for something when you talk about Whitney?" I laughed it off at the time. "She's just going through a lot." "Claire, she's been going through a lot for 3 years. At some point that stops being a crisis and starts being a personality." I didn't have an answer for that, not one I was ready to say out loud yet. But I thought about it more than I let on. When everything finally collapsed, Nora was one of the first people I called, sitting in my parents' kitchen 2 days after I'd left. She listened to the entire story without a single interruption, and when I finished, she said only, "I've been waiting for this call for 3 years. I just didn't want to be the one to push you into it." She flew out to see me twice during the months the case dragged on, both times without much notice, showing up with takeout and a bottle of sparkling cider since I couldn't drink, and simply sitting with me while I talked, or didn't talk, whichever I needed that day. She never once told me what to do. She just made it clear, every time, that whatever I decided, she'd already decided to be on my side of it. "You know what the difference is?" she said once, late one of those nights. "Between me and Whitney?" "What?" "I've never once needed anything from you to keep showing up." I thought about that a long time after she left. It turned out to be one of the truest things anyone said to me that whole year. The final settlement took another 6 weeks to actually process after the ruling came down, which Ms. Reyes told me was fairly normal. The legal decision and the practical execution of it rarely move at the same speed. I learned more about how divorce actually works, mechanically, than I'd ever wanted to know. Because we lived in an equitable distribution state, the court didn't simply split everything down the middle. It divided marital property in a way it considered fair, based on each person's contributions, both financial and otherwise. My years of unpaid labor running the household counted as a contribution. My premarital savings, once I proved they were mine before the marriage and traced where they'd gone, counted as a claim the court had to honor. None of it was automatic. all of it required paperwork, patience, and someone willing to actually read the fine print, which was where Ms. Reyes earned every cent I paid her. In the end, I received a settlement that covered a significant portion of what I'd spent over the years, along with a modest share of the equity built into the apartment during our marriage, which Daniel bought out rather than sell outright. Child support was set according to the state's standard guidelines, recalculated once the baby arrived, with automatic wage withholding so neither of us would ever have to negotiate a payment directly again. Ms. Reyes made sure of that detail specifically. "You'll thank me for this part later," she said, when I asked why it mattered so much. "The less two people who used to be married have to talk to each other about money, the better it goes for everyone, especially the kid." The apartment sale closed on a gray Tuesday in early spring. I wasn't there for the closing itself. There was no reason for me to be. But Dad drove me past the building once, a few weeks later, on our way back from a doctor's appointment. I looked up at the window that used to be our living room and felt, strangely, almost nothing. Not grief, not anger. Just the flat, quiet recognition of a place that used to matter and no longer did. The one piece of the old life I did have to physically deal with was my wedding ring, sitting in a small box in my dresser drawer since the night I packed my suitcase. I'd thought, at various points, about selling it, about keeping it for some vague sentimental reason I couldn't name, about mailing it back to Daniel just to be rid of the decision entirely. In the end, I did none of those things. I took it to a jeweler in town and had the stone reset into a small pendant, something that no longer looked like what it used to be, and gave it to my mother. "I don't need a reminder of the marriage," I told her. "But I don't want to erase that 7 years happened either. It made me who I am now, even the bad parts." Mom cried a little, put the pendant on right there in the shop, and wore it every day after that. I liked that better than any ending I could have written for that ring myself. The last stretch of the pregnancy passed more peacefully than I expected. The business was growing slowly but steadily, and I'd started scaling back my hours to rest more as my due date approached. One morning in early summer, the first contractions started, mild at first, easy to mistake for the usual aches of late pregnancy, until they weren't. Mom moved into motion instantly, the way she always did in a crisis, gathering the hospital bag we'd packed weeks earlier, checking the contents twice even though nothing had changed since the first time she checked it. Dad pulled the car around before I'd even finished putting my shoes on. Labor lasted longer than any of the pamphlets or birthing classes had prepared me for, nearly 14 hours from the first real contraction to the moment they finally placed my daughter on my chest. I remember very little of the middle stretch of it with any clarity, just fragments, the overhead lights, Mom's hand gripping mine so tightly I could feel her wedding ring pressing into my palm, a nurse's calm voice telling me I was doing great. One more push. Almost there. And then, all at once, a sound I'd never heard before and somehow recognized instantly, my daughter's first cry, thin and furious and absolutely perfect. The doctor set her on my chest, still slick and impossibly small, and said, "A healthy girl." I looked down at her, red-faced and outraged at the whole business of being born, and felt something in my chest crack open in the best possible way. Every single thing I'd gone through in the past 7 months, the courtroom, the lawyers, the cold silence from a man I used to love, all of it folded itself into something that finally felt worth the cost. Mom was crying beside me, unashamed, gripping my shoulder. "You did it, honey." I named her Grace. Not for any particular person, just for the word itself, and what I hoped it might mean for the kind of life I wanted her to have, one built on steadiness instead of struggle, on people who showed up because they wanted to, rather than because they had to. The weeks after Grace was born blurred together in the particular way new motherhood does, day and night trading places without much warning, feeding schedules that made no sense on paper and somehow worked anyway. A fatigue so total it stopped registering as fatigue and just became the new baseline of being alive. Mom carried most of the household weight during those early weeks, refusing every offer I made to help with anything beyond caring for Grace herself. "You'll have plenty of years to do laundry," she told me once, gently pulling a basket out of my hands. "Right now, just learn her." And I did. I learned the specific cry that meant hungry versus the one that meant tired versus the rare, furious one that meant something had gone genuinely wrong. I learned the exact angle she liked to be held at to fall asleep fastest, the particular white noise that settled her when nothing else worked, the way her whole small body would go loose, and trusting the second she recognized my voice. Ryan came around often during those weeks, always with some small, thoughtful excuse: fruit from a farm he worked with, a book he thought I might like, once just a genuine reason to check in because he happened to be in the area. He never pushed for anything beyond friendship, and I never asked him to. There was something almost old-fashioned in the pace of it, the two of us circling something neither of us named out loud. Content, for the time being, to just let it exist without pressure. One afternoon, holding Grace while Ryan sat across from me at the kitchen table, he studied her face for a long moment. "She looks just like you." "I hope her personality doesn't," I said, only half joking. He looked at me steadily. "If her personality ends up anything like who you are now, that would be a genuinely good thing." I didn't have a response ready for that. I just smiled and let the silence hold it instead, the way I'd learned to let good things sit without needing to fill every quiet moment with words. A month after Grace arrived, I started easing back into the business. Just a few hours a day at first, building back up slowly as my energy returned. Mom handled most of the childcare during those hours without complaint, treating her granddaughter like a second chance at a version of motherhood she wanted to get exactly right. Time kept moving, the way it does regardless of what you're ready for, and Grace grew from a fragile newborn into a genuinely cheerful baby, quick to laugh, easy to soothe, entirely unbothered by the complicated road that had brought her into the world. By the time Grace turned 6 months old, the business had grown well past what I'd originally imagined for it. What started as a handful of weekly meal orders for neighbors and a few small catering jobs had turned into something with actual structure. A standing roster of regular customers, 3 part-time employees I'd hired to help with prep and delivery, and enough steady income that I stopped thinking of it as a project and started thinking of it as my career. I still remembered, with a kind of distant disbelief, sitting at my parents' kitchen table that first week home, doing math on napkins to figure out whether I could survive without ever touching another cent of Daniel's money again. I could. Not easily, not without real sacrifice in those early months, but I could. And there was a particular kind of pride in that I hadn't expected to feel this strongly. It wasn't the pride of winning against someone. It was the quieter pride of discovering I'd never actually needed rescuing in the first place, only the chance to prove it. Dad still helped with deliveries some mornings, though I'd started pushing back gently, telling him he didn't need to keep doing that at his age. He always waved me off. "I like driving. Don't take that away from me, too." Mom split her time between watching Grace and helping in the kitchen during our busiest days, a system that worked because none of us tried too hard to formalize it. It just happened, the way good arrangements between people who love each other tend to happen, without contracts or resentment. Just people showing up for each other because they wanted to. I hired a bookkeeper eventually, mostly as a joke to myself, since bookkeeping was the exact career I'd walked away from years earlier. But I didn't want the business to become another version of the thing I'd fled. My own hands managing every dollar alone, invisible and unacknowledged. I wanted, this time, for the numbers to be shared, documented, verifiable by someone other than just me. I think some part of me was still healing from years of being the only person who ever knew where the money actually went. News has a way of traveling even when nobody involved particularly wants it to. Nora heard things through mutual acquaintances still in the city, and she'd pass along fragments whenever we talked. Never with any real malice, just the same instinct anyone has to keep the people they love informed about the shape of the world around them. Daniel had lost his position at the tech company about 8 months after the divorce finalized. Some restructuring that, according to Nora's sources, had less to do with the economy and more to do with the fact that his focus had visibly slipped over the previous year. He'd taken something smaller at a different firm, a step down in both title and salary, though he was, by all accounts, still managing. Whitney's situation had unraveled further. Without my income quietly propping up her son's education and her mother's expenses, and without Daniel's paycheck stretched thin enough to cover the gap I'd left behind, the finances of that household had apparently become a real strain. Cody had transferred out of the private school he'd attended for years into the local public school, a fact Barbara had, according to Nora, been telling relatives was just a change of scenery, rather than what it actually was. I want to say I felt something sharp and satisfying hearing all this, the kind of vindication these stories are supposed to deliver. Mostly, though, I just felt a kind of tired recognition. The sense of watching a house built on a bad foundation finally settle into the cracks that were always going to be there eventually, whether I'd left or not. My leaving hadn't caused any of it. It had only removed the thing that was holding the cracks together long enough to hide them. "Do you feel bad for them?" Nora asked once after relaying an update. I thought about it honestly before answering. No, but I don't feel triumphant either. I think I've just stopped needing to feel anything about it at all. That, more than anything else, felt like the actual measure of how far I'd come. Grace's first birthday fell on a warm Saturday in early summer, and we kept it small, the way I kept most things now, family and the handful of people who'd actually shown up for me during the year that mattered most. Mom made her famous yellow cake, the same recipe she'd made for every birthday of mine growing up. Dad strung a banner across the porch that Grace immediately tried to grab at from her high chair, delighted by the crinkling sound the paper made under her fingers. Nora flew in for the weekend, arriving with a stuffed rabbit nearly as big as Grace herself, and a bottle of wine for the adults, which she poured generously once Grace had gone down for her nap. Ryan came too, arriving with a small potted plant for the porch, something he said would bloom every summer if we kept it watered, which struck me, watching him set it carefully in the corner of the yard, as exactly the kind of gift he'd choose. Quiet, useful, built to last, rather than to impress. Watching Grace smash a fistful of cake into her own face, utterly delighted with herself, surrounded by people who'd shown up for no reason except that they wanted to, I thought about the dinner table a year and a half earlier, the platters of food I'd spent hours preparing for people who criticized every dish before eating it anyway. The contrast wasn't lost on me. This was what a table was supposed to feel like. I'd just never had the chance to know that before. "She's lucky," Nora said quietly, watching Grace with her cake-covered hands, to grow up around people who actually like being here. "I think about that a lot," I admitted, "that she'll never know the version of family I grew up thinking was normal." "Good," Nora said simply. "Let her think this is normal instead." About 2 weeks after Grace's birthday, I got a message from Whitney. She wanted to meet. I sat with the request for a full day before responding. Part of me wanted to ignore it entirely. I owed her nothing, not even the courtesy of a reply. But another part of me, the part that had spent years being curious about the people who hurt her most, wanted to see, once and for all, what was actually left of that story once you took away the dinner table and the courtroom and every audience either of us used to perform for. We met at a small coffee shop downtown, neutral ground for both of us. She looked different than I remembered. Thinner, tired in a way that made her look older than she was, her clothes noticeably less put together than the version of Whitney who used to sneer at my grocery bags. "I was wrong," she said, before I'd even sat down fully. I didn't feel pride hearing it, and I didn't feel anger either. Just a kind of flat acknowledgement. "It's good that you understand that." "I'm not asking for forgiveness," she continued. "I just wanted to say it. For my own sake, for closure." I nodded. "That's enough." She seemed surprised by how little reaction I gave her. "You don't hate me?" I actually thought about the question seriously before answering. "I did, for a while. I don't anymore. I'm too busy living my own life to keep carrying that around." She looked at me for a long moment, something like genuine respect crossing her face for what might have been the first time in the entire history of our relationship. "You're stronger than I ever gave you credit for." I didn't need her to say that. I already knew it. But I let her say it anyway, because some people need to hear themselves admit a thing out loud before they can actually believe it, and I didn't see any reason to deny her that small mercy. Leaving the coffee shop, I felt lighter than I expected, a kind of clean, uncomplicated relief. I picked Grace up from Mom's a little while later, and she broke into that enormous, gap-toothed grin the second she spotted me, both arms reaching up. I scooped her into a tight hug and pressed my face into her hair. "It's all over now, baby girl," I whispered, and meant it in every sense I could think of. Ryan and I never had one of those clean movie-style moments where either of us announced what we were to each other. It happened the way most true things happen, slowly enough that by the time you notice it's real, it's already been real for a while. It was Grace who forced the question into the open, in the blunt, uncomplicated way toddlers force everything into the open. She'd started calling Ryan by name on her own months earlier, unprompted, somewhere between "Mama" and her first tentative steps across the living room floor. One evening, watching him fix a loose hinge on the pantry door while I finished cleaning up from dinner, she toddled over, tugged his pant leg, and asked, with the devastating clarity only a 2-year-old can manage, "Ryan, stay?" He looked up at her, then at me, something unguarded passing over his face before he caught it. "Do you want me to stay, kiddo?" She nodded like this was the most obvious question in the world. He looked at me next, and I understood the question wasn't really meant for Grace anymore. "Do you want that too?" he asked, quiet enough that it felt like it belonged only to the two of us, even with Grace standing right there between us. I thought about the version of myself who used to wait up nights for a man who never once asked what I wanted, only what I could provide. I thought about how different this felt, being asked plainly instead of assumed upon. "Yes," I said. "I do." He didn't kiss me that night, not with Grace still awake and watching us both with frank toddler interest. He just reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small box he'd clearly been carrying around for longer than I realized, and inside it was a thin silver bracelet, small enough for a child's wrist, with a tiny charm shaped like a 4-leaf clover. "For Grace," he clarified, catching the look on my face. "For good luck. I wasn't trying to rush anything bigger than that tonight." I laughed, something loosening in my chest that had been tight for longer than I could remember. "You're allowed to rush a little. We're not made of glass." He smiled at that, slow and real. Noted. We didn't make any grand declarations that night. We just settled into what we already were, quietly, the way two people settle into a house they've already been living in together for months without either of them saying so out loud. By Grace's second birthday, the business had outgrown the little storefront near the market entirely. I signed a lease on a larger space 2 blocks over, big enough for a proper commercial kitchen and a small seating area where customers could grab something quick instead of only ordering ahead. I hired a manager to help run daily operations so I wasn't the only person holding the whole thing together, a lesson I'd learned the hard way from years of being the only person who ever quietly held anything together. A local paper ran a small feature on the expansion, a few paragraphs and a photo of me, standing in the new kitchen, apron on, Grace balanced on my hip because she'd refused to stay with the sitter that particular afternoon. The reporter asked, toward the end of the interview, what had made me want to start the business in the first place. I gave her the short version, the one that fit in a quote, that I'd wanted to build something that was entirely mine, from the ground up, after a difficult year that taught me the value of not depending on anyone else to define what my life looked like. I didn't give her the longer version, the one about a dinner table and a courtroom, and a man who chose silence over defending me one too many times. Some parts of a story are only for the people who lived through them alongside you, not for a stranger with a notepad. However kindly she asked. Ryan came by the shop most evenings after his own work wrapped up, sometimes to help close, sometimes just to sit at the counter with Grace while I finished the last of the day's orders. He'd started, without either of us formally deciding it, becoming a fixture in both our lives in a way that felt sturdy rather than sudden, the exact opposite of everything I'd learned to associate with love the first time around. Watching my parents move through their own decades-long marriage during those years, Dad still driving deliveries some mornings just because he liked the excuse to be useful, Mom still fussing over whether everyone had eaten enough at every single meal, I started to understand something about them I hadn't fully appreciated as a kid. They'd never had much money. The hardware store barely broke even some years, and there'd been stretches during my childhood I only pieced together as an adult. Stretches where Dad quietly took on extra work fixing appliances around the neighborhood just to cover a bad month. But I never once, in my entire childhood, doubted that they were on the same side of things. Whatever hardship came at them, it came at both of them together, and they met it as a unit, rather than as two people keeping score against each other. I asked Mom about it once, sitting on the porch while Grace napped inside. Did you and Dad ever fight about money, growing up? I don't remember it, but I have to imagine you did. She thought about it for a while before answering. Of course we did. Every couple fights about money eventually. The difference is whether you're fighting about how to solve a problem together or fighting about who gets to blame the other person for it. She looked at me carefully. That's the thing you never had with Daniel, sweetheart. Not really. You were always trying to solve problems alone, and he was always looking for someone to blame for them. I sat with that for a long time after she said it. It was, I think, the single clearest explanation anyone gave me for the entire 7 years of that marriage, distilled down into one honest sentence from a woman who'd had 4 decades to learn the difference herself. Do you worry about me and Ryan? I asked eventually. She smiled, the real kind, not the polite one she used to give Daniel at family dinners. No. I've watched how he looks at you. He looks at you like someone trying to solve things with you, not around you. She paused. That's the only thing that ever really mattered in the end. Everything else is just details. People ask me sometimes, now that enough time has passed for the story to have softened into something I can talk about without my hands shaking, whether I've forgiven Daniel. It's a question that assumes forgiveness is a single door you walk through once, and it's done. And I don't think that's true. Not for something that took 7 years to build and nearly as long to fully dismantle. What I can say is this. I don't carry anger toward him anymore, not the hot, immediate kind that used to flare up whenever his name came up in conversation. What's left instead is something closer to a clear-eyed understanding of who he actually was, underneath the version of him I'd fallen in love with at 20. He wasn't a monster. He was a man who chose the path of least resistance every single time it mattered, right up until the moment that path cost him the family he claimed he wanted. And by then, it was too late to choose differently. Whitney, I think, will always be a harder case for me, because her cruelty was active where his was passive, deliberate where his was merely weak. But even there, watching her sit across from me in that coffee shop, thinner and tireder than the version of her who used to sneer at my shopping bags, I found I couldn't sustain the anger long enough to make it worth carrying. Anger, I learned, takes real maintenance. At some point, I simply had better things to spend that energy on. Barbara never reached out to apologize. Not directly. Not in the 2 years since everything ended. I heard, through the same grapevine that carried every other piece of news, that she'd mellowed somewhat once Whitney's situation forced her to actually reckon with the cost of the loyalty she'd spent years defending unconditionally. Whether that mellowing ever crystallized into genuine reflection, I couldn't say, and I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I didn't particularly need to know. Some people's growth simply isn't yours to witness or account for. You can only handle your own. Daniel did eventually ask for more involvement in Grace's life, about 1.5 years after the divorce finalized, once the initial shock of the settlement had worn off and something like genuine parental instinct seemed to catch up with him. He reached out through his lawyer this time, formally, requesting a standard visitation schedule. I won't pretend my first instinct wasn't to refuse outright. Some deep, still wounded part of me wanted to keep Grace entirely separate from that side of her family, to build her whole world out of people who'd actually earned a place in it. But Ms. Reyes, whom I still consulted from time to time even after the case officially closed, talked me through it with the same clear-eyed practicality she'd shown from our very first meeting. "He's her father, whatever else he is," she said. "The law recognizes that, and honestly, so should you, separate from whatever you feel about him personally. Kids benefit from knowing both parents as long as it's safe, and frankly, a documented, court-approved schedule protects you too. It's better than leaving things vague and hoping he behaves." I agreed eventually to a modest schedule. 1 weekend visit a month, supervised at first by mutual agreement, then unsupervised once Grace was old enough, and Daniel had demonstrated, over several visits, that he could be trusted with the basic responsibilities of caring for a small child on his own. The first few visits were stiff and awkward, Daniel clearly uncertain how to be a father in short, scheduled bursts after years of being largely absent even when he lived under the same roof as a pregnant wife. But he tried, in his own limited way. He showed up on time. He asked me actual questions about her routines, her allergies, her favorite foods, instead of assuming he already knew. Slowly, over the better part of a year, something like an actual relationship started to form between them. Thin and new, but real. I never pretended, to Grace or to myself, that this made up for the 7 years he'd spent choosing his sister's version of events over his own wife's reality. But I also never wanted Grace to inherit my anger as her own inheritance. She deserved the chance to form her own opinion of her father, built on her own experience of him, rather than the weight of mine. "Do you ever get jealous?" Ryan asked once, gently, after dropping Grace off from one of her visits with Daniel. "Watching him get to be part of her life after everything?" I thought about it honestly. No. What I feel is more like relief, honestly. Relief that I don't have to be the only adult in her life managing that relationship anymore. That's his job now, not mine to carry for him. Grace started asking questions about her father earlier than I expected, the particular unfiltered curiosity of a 4-year-old who'd noticed, correctly, that her family looked different from some of her friends' families. "Why doesn't Daddy live with us?" she asked one evening, apropos of nothing, while I braided her hair before bed. I'd thought about this question for years before she ever actually asked it, turning over dozens of possible answers in my head, trying to find the version that was honest without being unkind, that respected her right to know something true about her own history without burdening her with the full weight of mine. Sometimes, I told her, two people love each other very much and still can't make a family work together. That doesn't mean either of them stopped loving you. It just means the two of them couldn't figure out how to be a family in the same house anymore. Was it my fault? The question landed like a small blow, and I made sure my voice stayed perfectly steady answering it. Never. Not for one single second. You were the best thing that came out of that whole time, sweetheart. Nothing about any of it was ever your fault. She seemed to accept that, the way kids often accept things adults present with enough calm certainty, and went back to asking about something else entirely within minutes, the particular gift small children have for not lingering in heavy places longer than necessary. I never told her the specifics, not at 4, not really even now. She knows her parents divorced before she was born. She knows her father lives in the city and sees her once a month. She knows Ryan, who she now simply calls Dad, having decided on that title herself sometime around her 3rd birthday, without any prompting from either of the adults in the room. She doesn't know about the dinner table, or the courtroom, or the years of quiet, unacknowledged sacrifice that preceded all of it. I've decided that story is mine to carry, not hers to inherit before she's old enough to actually process it on her own terms. Someday, when she's old enough to ask the harder questions and actually want the harder answers, I'll tell her everything. Not as a cautionary tale about her father, but as an honest account of what her mother learned about herself in the hardest year of her life. I think that's a better inheritance than anger would have been. Ryan and I got married 2.5 years after Grace was born, a small ceremony in my parents' backyard, the same yard where I'd once sat as a teenager doing homework at the same porch table my father still ate breakfast at every morning. Nora stood beside me. Grace, 5 by then, insisted on carrying the rings herself in a small basket she'd decorated with stickers, and dropped them twice on the walk down the aisle, which nobody minded in the slightest. Mom cried through the entire ceremony. Dad gave a short, characteristically understated toast that ended with the line, "I've learned not to worry about my daughter anymore. She knows how to build a good life now, with or without help. But it's nice that she's got help anyway." It got a laugh, and it also happened to be exactly true. Daniel wasn't there, obviously, though he sent Grace a small gift a few days later, a book she'd mentioned wanting during one of their visits. I appreciated the gesture more than I expected to. It suggested he was, at minimum, actually paying attention to his daughter's life now, something he'd rarely managed to do with mine. I think about family differently now than I did at 24, walking down a different aisle with a very different sense of what I was building. Back then, I thought family was something you were handed, something you owed loyalty to simply because blood or marriage said so, regardless of whether the people inside it treated you with any actual care. I spent 7 years operating on that belief, and it cost me more than money, more than time. It cost me years of believing my own needs were somehow less legitimate than everyone else's. What I understand now is that family is something you build with the people who actually show up, consistently, without needing anything from you in return, except the same steadiness you're offering them. My parents taught me that, without ever explicitly saying so, just by being exactly that kind of steady for 6 decades of marriage. Nora taught me that, by staying present through years when it would have been easier to drift away. Ryan taught me that, in the quiet, unhurried way he built a place in Grace's life and mine without ever once demanding it. Blood gave me a mother-in-law who measured my worth in dust and dinner plates, and a sister-in-law who spent years dismantling my marriage from the inside for her own comfort. Choice gave me everyone who actually mattered in the end. I know now which one to trust. 5 years out from that dinner table, if I try to take stock of everything that's changed, the list runs longer than I expect every time I actually sit down to count it. The business now employs 11 people across 2 locations, the original storefront near the market, and a second one that opened last spring on the other side of town, closer to the hospital, where the lunch crowd from the medical offices nearby keeps us busier most days than I ever imagined possible, back when I was calculating grocery costs on napkins at my parents' kitchen table. I still cook some days myself, mostly because I want to, not because I have to. The particular freedom of choosing your own labor instead of having it assigned to you by people who never once said thank you for it. Grace is 7 now, sharp-tongued and stubborn in a way that reminds me, sometimes uncomfortably, of exactly how I used to be before 7 years of marriage sanded most of that stubbornness down to nothing. I like watching it in her. I make a point of never once telling her to soften it. Her brother Sam arrived 2 years ago, Ryan's and mine, a genuinely easy baby who slept through the night by 10 weeks, and has been, according to everyone who's ever met him, the calmest presence in a house that otherwise runs at Grace's considerably higher volume. Watching Ryan with him, patient in a way I don't think I ever once witnessed from Daniel in even his best moments, I understand more clearly every year what my mother meant about the difference between someone who solves problems with you and someone who's only ever looking for someone else to blame. My parents are both still healthy, still living in the same house, still bickering good-naturedly over small things the way they always have. Dad finally retired from the hardware store 2 years back, sold it to a young couple who kept the name and most of the original staff, and now spends most of his time exactly as he always wanted to. Puttering around a garden he never had time for while he was working, driving grandchildren to school when I let him. Which is often, because he still likes the excuse to be useful, and I've stopped trying to take that away from him. Daniel still sees Grace once a month, a rhythm that's held steady for years now without much drama attached to it anymore. He remarried about 3 years ago, someone I've never met and have no particular curiosity about, and by all accounts he's settled into a quieter, more modest version of the life he used to have. I don't wish him harm. I also don't think about him much at all these days, which feels like the more honest measure of how thoroughly that chapter actually closed. If I could sit down across from the version of myself who stood in that kitchen 7 years ago, sweating over a stove for people who criticized every dish before eating it anyway, I don't know that I'd tell her to leave sooner. Hindsight makes that advice too easy, too clean, ignoring everything that made staying feel, at the time, like the only reasonable option available to a person who genuinely believed love was supposed to survive anything if you just tried hard enough. What I'd tell her instead is this: patience aimed at the wrong people doesn't purchase safety. It only teaches them that your limits are negotiable, that enough pressure, applied consistently enough, will eventually move you. I spent 7 years believing that enduring quietly was itself a kind of strength, that swallowing every insult and covering every bill without complaint was proof of my commitment to something larger than myself. It wasn't strength. It was just a slower, quieter kind of surrender, dressed up in language about family loyalty so it didn't have to look like what it actually was. The old version of me endured because she believed, genuinely and without cynicism, in family, in love, in the idea that loyalty given freely would eventually be returned in kind. That belief wasn't foolish. It's actually one of the better instincts a person can have. But a life isn't built on one person's faith alone. It depends just as much on the actual character of the people standing beside you, and no amount of belief on my part could manufacture decency in people who'd never had much interest in offering it back. My mistake was never in loving too much or giving too freely. It was in extending that love and generosity to people who hadn't earned the right to receive it, and mistaking their comfort with my sacrifice for some kind of mutual arrangement. I discovered my actual worth only once I was forced to, by circumstance, to stop performing generosity and start protecting myself instead. There's a particular kind of grace in that discovery, even though it arrived wrapped in genuine pain to get there. I don't think that grace was luck. I think it was simply what happens once you finally wake up. Whitney, in the end, paid the price her own choices built for her, not because I orchestrated any of it, but because greed dressed up as entitlement eventually runs out of other people's patience to feed on. Daniel wasn't a villain in the way stories sometimes need one to be. He was something more common and, in its own way, sadder. A man who lacked the simple courage to defend what was actually true in front of people, whose approval mattered more to him than his own wife's basic dignity. A man who can't protect the family in front of him, I've come to believe, eventually loses it, whether through one dramatic betrayal or 100 small failures of nerve that add up to the same result. And me? What I walked away with wasn't only what the law decided I was owed, though I'm grateful for every bit of it. Grateful, in particular, to a sharp, unflinching lawyer who believed my case was worth fighting properly instead of just quickly. What I actually walked away with was an entirely new life, one where I no longer have to perform likability for people who were never going to like me regardless of what I gave them. A life where I know, with total certainty now, exactly what I'm worth, and exactly who's earned the privilege of standing beside me while I spend it. I didn't ask Ryan about his own past for a long time, mostly because I'd spent so many years learning to keep my own guard up that it took real effort to remember other people were allowed to have complicated histories too, not just cautionary tales attached to them. He told me eventually, on one of those long evenings after Grace had gone to bed, when the two of us sat out on the porch with tea instead of anything stronger, since I was still nursing at the time. He'd been engaged once, years before I ran into him at that coffee shop, to a woman named Paige he'd met at a farming conference 2 states over. They'd dated 3 years, gotten engaged, started planning a wedding, and then, 6 weeks before the date, she'd called it off entirely, citing a feeling that had apparently been building for months that she wasn't actually ready to settle into the kind of steady, small-town life he was building. I don't blame her, looking back, he said, turning his mug slowly in his hands. She wanted something bigger than what I could offer her. It just took me longer than it should have to accept that wanting different things isn't the same as either person being wrong. Did it wreck you? I asked. The way mine wrecked me? He thought about it honestly before answering, which I'd come to recognize as one of his most reliable habits, never rushing an answer just to fill a silence. Not the same way. Nobody lied to me for years to get there. She was honest in the end, even if the timing was terrible. That's a different kind of hurt than what you went through. Mine healed faster because there wasn't any betrayal underneath it, just two people wanting different lives. Do you still think about her? Sometimes. Mostly I think about the version of myself who was so focused on building the right life that I forgot to check whether the person standing next to me actually wanted the same one. He looked at me then, steady in the way that had become so familiar, it barely registered as remarkable anymore, though it still was. I don't have that problem with you. I checked. Repeatedly. I laughed, real and unguarded. When exactly did you check? Every single time you told me about the business, or Grace, or your parents, and your whole face lit up talking about building something instead of just surviving it. That's not a woman who wants something bigger than a good, steady life. That's a woman who already knows exactly what she wants, and just needed the room to go build it. He shrugged, like the observation cost him nothing, though I understood, hearing it, exactly how much attention it had actually required. I wasn't going to make the mistake of not noticing that twice. About 3 years after the divorce, Daniel's extended family held some kind of reunion, the details of which reached me secondhand through Nora, who'd heard about it from someone who'd heard about it from someone else, the way these things always traveled through that particular network of people who'd once been, however briefly, my in-laws. I wasn't invited, obviously, and wouldn't have gone if I had been. But Grace was invited, through Daniel, as his daughter, and I had to make a decision I hadn't fully anticipated needing to make. Whether to let her attend a gathering full of people who'd once treated her mother with open contempt, people she had no memory of and no context for, beyond the vague, careful explanations I'd given her about her father's side of the family. I talked it through with Ryan for most of an evening, weighing what felt like competing obligations, protecting Grace from people who'd earned no right to any relationship with her, against denying her the chance to know her own extended family on her own terms, without my history coloring every interaction before she'd even had the chance to form her own opinion. In the end, I let her go, with clear boundaries. Daniel would stay with her the entire time. She'd call me if anything felt wrong, and she understood in the simplified language appropriate for a 6-year-old that if anyone was unkind to her, she could ask to leave immediately, and Daniel had promised, in writing, to bring her straight home if she asked. She came back that evening full of stories about cousins she'd never met, and a great aunt who'd given her a piece of candy from her purse, delighted by the sheer novelty of an extended family she'd only vaguely understood existed before that day. Barbara, she reported, had been kind of quiet, but had given her a hug goodbye. Whitney apparently hadn't attended at all, something Daniel confirmed later when I asked, mentioning only briefly that things between him and his sister had grown distant in the years since the divorce, a fact that landed with a kind of grim, unsurprised satisfaction I wasn't proud of feeling, but didn't try particularly hard to suppress either. Was it good? I asked Grace that night, tucking her into bed. It was good, she said, already half asleep. Everyone was nice to me. That was, in the end, all I'd actually wanted for her. Not vindication, not some dramatic reckoning where everyone finally understood what they'd done to me. Just the simple, uncomplicated experience of being treated kindly by people who'd never once managed to extend that same kindness to her mother. If Grace got to have that, unburdened by everything I'd carried, I decided I could live with the rest of it remaining exactly as unresolved as it apparently was going to stay. I ran into Daniel's new wife exactly once, at a grocery store 2 towns over, entirely by accident, the kind of encounter neither of us could have planned for and both of us handled, I think, about as gracefully as the situation allowed. I recognized her from a photo Grace had shown me once, unprompted, on Daniel's phone during a pickup. She recognized me, I assume, from whatever Daniel had told her about his first marriage, though I'll never know exactly what version of that story he'd chosen to share. We stood there for a moment in the cereal aisle, both clearly aware of who the other was, neither of us quite sure what the social script called for in this particular, oddly specific scenario. She spoke first. "You're Claire." "I am, and you must be Rachel." "I am." She hesitated, then added carefully, "Grace talks about you constantly. She's a wonderful kid." "Thank you," I said, and meant it, surprised by how little defensiveness the compliment triggered in me. "She talks about you too, actually. She likes you." Something eased in Rachel's shoulders at that, like she'd been braced for a very different conversation. "I wasn't sure how this would go, running into you like this." "Neither was I admitted. "But for what it's worth, I don't have anything against you. Whatever happened between Daniel and me happened years before you were ever in the picture. That's not yours to carry." She looked at me for a long moment, something like genuine gratitude passing over her face. "Thank you for saying that. I've worried about it more than I probably should have." We didn't become friends after that exactly, but we developed a kind of easy, low-stakes cordiality whenever our paths crossed at school events, or the rare family gathering Grace attended on Daniel's side. I think we both understood, without ever saying it directly, that whatever had gone wrong in that first marriage had very little to do with her, and holding on to resentment toward a woman who'd simply met Daniel after the wreckage was already made would have cost me something I wasn't willing to spend anymore. Energy better used on people who'd actually earned my attention. People sometimes ask why I'm willing to talk about any of this at all, given how private I kept most of it while it was actually happening. The truth is, for a long time, I didn't want to be defined by it. I didn't want to be the woman with the divorce story, the cautionary tale other people whispered about at dinner parties, reduced down to a single dramatic year instead of the whole life I'd built before and after it. What changed my mind wasn't any single moment, but an accumulation of quieter conversations, women I'd meet through the business, or through Grace's school, or through the extended, loosely connected network any small town eventually builds around itself, who'd hear some fragment of my story and lean in with a familiar, careful look on their face, the look of someone recognizing a shape they knew intimately from their own life. One woman, a regular customer at the shop, told me once, almost in passing while waiting for an order, that she'd spent 6 years quietly covering her own in-laws' expenses while her husband looked the other way, convinced that speaking up would make her the villain of her own marriage. She hadn't told anyone that detail before, not even her closest friends. She told me, she said, because she assumed I'd actually understand it without needing the whole context explained. I did understand it, immediately and completely, and it occurred to me, hearing her say it out loud for what sounded like the first time, that silence hadn't protected me during those 7 years. It had only protected the people who benefited from my not speaking up. The same was almost certainly true for her, and for however many other women were sitting on some version of that same quiet, unspoken math, convinced that naming it out loud would somehow make them the unreasonable one. So I started telling the story more openly, not for sympathy, and not out of any lingering need to punish anyone who'd wronged me. I tell it because somewhere out there is a woman standing at her own stove, feeling nauseous and unacknowledged, wondering whether the exhaustion she's carrying is just what marriage is supposed to feel like. I want her to know it isn't. I want her to know that the moment she finally says the word mine out loud, whatever chaos follows that sentence is worth it. Every single time. If I could leave one practical thing behind for any woman standing where I once stood, it would be this: document everything, long before you ever think you'll need to. I got lucky, in a sense, because some instinct in me started keeping records years before I ever considered a divorce, screenshots and receipts and bank statements I told myself I was saving just in case, without letting myself examine too closely what exactly I was preparing for. That instinct turned out to be the single most important decision I made in that entire marriage, more important, in practical terms, than any speech I ever gave at any dinner table. Money in a marriage isn't romantic to think about, and for years I avoided thinking about it clearly because it felt transactional, felt like it cheapened something that was supposed to be about love instead. I understand now that this instinct, however well-intentioned, is exactly the vulnerability people like Whitney and Barbara knew how to exploit. Ambiguity about money in a marriage doesn't protect the marriage. It just protects whoever benefits from nobody keeping score, and in my case, that was never me. If you're contributing your own premarital savings to a shared household, keep the paper trail, not because you expect the marriage to fail, but because a fair partnership shouldn't depend on nobody ever needing to prove what actually happened. If you're covering expenses that don't belong to your own household, your spouse's siblings' bills, in-laws' medical costs, ask yourself honestly whether that generosity is being reciprocated in any form, or whether it's simply being absorbed, expected, and eventually assumed to be permanent. And if the day ever comes where you have to walk into a lawyer's office, know that the law, at least in most states, does not simply reward whoever earned more on paper. It considers the whole shape of a marriage, the invisible labor, the sacrificed careers, the years spent making a household function while someone else's name sat alone on the paycheck. That protection exists because women before me fought to have it written into the law. Use it. Don't let pride or exhaustion talk you out of claiming what you're actually owed, simply because asking for it feels, in the moment, like admitting the marriage was always more transactional than you wanted to believe. It wasn't transactional to give generously for 7 years. It only becomes transactional the moment you're asked to prove it happened at all. And by then, the only thing that matters is whether you kept the proof. Most nights now, once Grace and Sam are both finally down and the house has gone quiet, I still find myself sitting by the window for a while before heading to bed. An old habit from that first-year home that never quite left me, even once everything it used to hold had resolved itself into something calm and settled. I watch the lights of the small downtown strip a few blocks over, the same lights I used to watch from my old bedroom window the night I came home with a suitcase, and a secret I hadn't yet told anyone but a doctor. Back then, those lights felt like the edge of everything I'd lost, a whole life I'd built collapsing behind me, while I sat in a house I thought I'd left for good at 22. Now they just look like home. Not because anything about the view changed, but because everything underneath me did. I think, some nights, about the woman standing at that stove 7 years ago, shifting between heavy pans, swallowing nausea she didn't yet understand, trying to make herself smaller and more agreeable in a house that had never once made room for her to be anything else. I don't feel sorry for her exactly. I feel something closer to gratitude. The strange, specific gratitude you feel toward an earlier version of yourself who endured something long enough to eventually learn the actual lesson buried inside it. Losses are inevitable, I've come to believe, in any life worth actually living. What matters isn't avoiding them. What matters is what they teach you to hold on to once they're finally over. I lost 7 years to people who never deserved that much of my time or my money or my quiet, constant effort. But because of that loss, I found my own worth clearly enough to never again mistake someone's comfort with my sacrifice for love. I am not the woman who once stood silently in that kitchen, swallowing every insult rather than risk the peace of a household that was never peaceful to begin with. I am the woman who built a business from a stack of napkin math at her parents' kitchen table, who raised a daughter and then a son inside a home built on people who actually show up, who learned, at real cost, exactly what she's worth, and exactly who's earned the privilege of standing beside her while she spends it. The lights outside my window haven't changed at all in 5 years. I'm the one who's different now, and this time, whatever I've finally built for myself, I have no intention of letting go of it again. Of everyone tangled up in that old life, Cody is the one I think about with the least resentment. Maybe because he was a child through most of it, shaped by adults who never gave him much of a fair model to learn from. He's 14 now, and Grace, through the strange, resilient logic of children, still considers him something like a cousin, despite everything that happened between the adults in both their lives before either of them were old enough to understand any of it. Daniel brings him along occasionally during his visitation weekends, an arrangement I agreed to cautiously at first and have since come to appreciate more than I expected to. He's quieter than I remember him being as a small boy, more careful, the particular carefulness of a kid who grew up watching his mother's finances and comfort slowly collapse and learned, probably too early, that stability isn't something you can take for granted. He transferred to public school the year after the divorce, The fact Barbara had spun as just a change of scenery to anyone who'd listen. And by every account I've heard since, he's actually thrived there in ways he never quite managed at the private school Whitney had insisted on for years, largely on my dime. I asked Daniel once, carefully, whether Cody knew the full history, whether anyone had ever explained to him exactly how his tuition had been paid for all those years, and by whom. He's figured out enough of it on his own, Daniel admitted. Kids usually do, eventually. I don't know what Cody thinks of me now, if he thinks of me at all beyond the vague category of Grace's mom. But I've decided, watching him grow into a quieter, more grounded kid than either his mother or grandmother ever managed to be, that whatever damage was done in that house wasn't entirely his to inherit either. He didn't choose his mother's schemes any more than Grace chose the wreckage that preceded her birth. I try to extend him the same grace I've tried to build my entire life around, extending to my own children. The assumption that a person's worst relatives don't have to define the shape of who they eventually become. Ms. Reyes and I still talk occasionally, years after the case officially closed, an unlikely friendship that grew out of what started as a strictly professional arrangement between a stressed, pregnant client and the lawyer who refused to let her settle for less than she was owed. She came to Grace's first birthday, and then her second, developing over the years into something like an honorary aunt, the kind Grace has never had to question the loyalty of, unlike the version her father's family provided. Sandra jokes sometimes that mine is still one of her favorite cases, not because of the money involved, which was modest by the standards of the more complicated divorces she typically handles, but because of how clearly it resolved. Most of my clients, she told me once, over coffee a few years after everything settled, come in already broken down, convinced they don't deserve half of what the law actually entitles them to. You came in with 3 years of receipts already organized in a folder. I don't think I've ever had an easier case to build, purely because you'd already done half my job for me before you ever sat down in my office. I didn't know I was building a case, I told her. I just knew I wanted proof someday that I wasn't who they said I was. That instinct, she said, is the same instinct that wins cases. You just didn't know that's what you were doing yet. She's the one, more than almost anyone else from that period, who taught me that the law isn't some abstract, impersonal system indifferent to fairness. It's a tool, and like any tool, its usefulness depends entirely on whether someone's willing to actually pick it up and use it properly on your behalf. I got lucky finding her. I've since referred at least 4 other women to her office, each one carrying some version of the same quiet exhaustion I once carried into that same waiting room, and each one, as far as I know, walked out with considerably more than they thought they were entitled to ask for. Keep sending them, Sandra told me the last time we spoke. That's the only thank you I actually need from you at this point. Nora gave the toast at my wedding to Ryan, standing up in my parents' backyard with a glass of champagne and the particular confidence of someone who'd known me long enough to say true things without softening them for the sake of a nice moment. I've known Claire since we were 19 years old, sharing a dorm room with a broken radiator and a landlord who never once fixed it, she started, drawing a laugh from the small crowd. And I want to tell you all something about her that I don't think everyone in this yard fully appreciates. This is a woman who spent 7 years convincing herself that being agreeable was the same thing as being loved. I watched that happen, slowly, over years of phone calls where she'd explain away things that should have never needed explaining in the first place. The yard went a little quieter, the good kind of quiet, everyone leaning slightly forward. And then, one dinner, she stopped explaining. She just said one true sentence out loud, about money that was actually hers, and the whole house of cards fell down around her in about 90 seconds. I've never been prouder of anyone in my life than I was getting that phone call. She raised her glass a little higher. Ryan, I'll say this plainly because somebody should. You're marrying a woman who already knows exactly what she's worth. Your only job now is to never, ever make her doubt that again. I promise you, the rest of us will hold you to it. Ryan laughed, raised his own glass toward her, and said simply, "Understood." I cried through most of it. The good kind of crying, the kind that doesn't need explaining to anyone standing close enough to see it. Grace, sitting on my father's lap nearby, asked loudly why Mommy was crying at a happy party, and the whole yard laughed again, and somehow that was the moment that stuck with me longest afterward, more than the vows, more than the first dance under my parents' string lights. Just a yard full of people who'd actually shown up, laughing together at exactly the right moment, with no performance required from any of us. If you've read this far, I suspect you already know some version of this story yourself, whether it's your own marriage or your mother's, or a friend's you've watched from a careful, worried distance, wondering when or if she'd finally say the sentence that changes everything. I don't have a tidy formula for when that moment arrives. Mine came at a dinner table, over a platter of sweet and sour chicken I'd spent 2 hours making for people who criticized it before they finished eating it anyway. Yours might come somewhere else entirely, in a car, in a kitchen, in the quiet middle of an ordinary Tuesday that doesn't look, from the outside, like the kind of day anything gets decided in. What I can tell you, with total certainty now, is that the sentence itself matters less than the moment you finally believe you're allowed to say it. Mine was 4 words long. That money was mine. It cost me a marriage, a house, 7 years of a life I'd built around the wrong foundation entirely. It also, in the same breath, gave me back a version of myself I'd stopped believing was still in there, patiently waiting for someone to finally let her speak. I think about that woman at the stove sometimes, nauseous and exhausted and still, somehow, trying to make the meal perfect for people who'd never once said thank you for it. I don't wish I'd told her to leave sooner. I wish I'd told her, simply, that she was allowed to stop performing gratitude for people who'd never earned it, long before circumstance finally forced the issue on its own. She got there anyway, in the end. That's the part I hold on to now, sitting by this same kind of window years later. A husband who actually listens asleep down the hall. 2 children who will never know the version of family I once mistook for normal. Losses are inevitable, but they teach you, if you let them, exactly what's worth holding on to once the noise finally clears. I know now, and this time, I'm not letting go of it again. I want to close with something more practical than sentimental, because I think the sentimental parts of this story are easy enough to nod along with and then forget by the time real life asks something of you. Here is what nobody explained to me clearly enough, back when I was 24 and moving 3 states away for a man I trusted completely. Marriage does not automatically merge 2 people's financial histories into one indistinguishable pool, no matter how often someone tells you there's no such thing as my money once you're married. In most states, what you bring into a marriage remains legally yours, unless you commingle it so thoroughly that tracing it becomes impossible, or unless you sign it away, knowingly or not, in an agreement you didn't fully understand. I nearly signed exactly that kind of agreement, in the first draft Daniel's lawyers sent me, the one asking me to waive any claim to marital property, any request for support, any acknowledgement of the money I'd spent over 7 years keeping his extended family financially afloat. I didn't sign it because a lawyer I'd never met before that week took one look at the paperwork and told me, plainly, that I was being asked to disappear from my own marriage with nothing to show for 7 years of very real, very quantifiable contribution. If there is one thing I'd want any woman reading this to actually do differently than I did, it isn't leaving sooner, or trusting less, or loving with more caution. It's simpler than that. Know where your money goes. Keep your own records. Separate from whatever household system your marriage runs on. If you're the one managing bills, tuition, insurance, groceries, keep proof of it, not because you expect to need it, but because a fair partnership shouldn't require you to reconstruct 7 years of contribution from memory alone, if the day ever comes that you do need it. And if that day comes, find a lawyer who treats your case like it matters, not like a formality to process quickly and move past. The difference between the lawyer willing to actually read your bank statements line by line and one who simply files the standard paperwork is, in my experience, the difference between walking away with what you're owed and walking away with whatever the other side decided to offer you. I got lucky. I found the first kind of lawyer, mostly by accident, in a small office 2 blocks from my parents' old house, run by a woman who looked at 3 years of quietly gathered receipts and saw, immediately, exactly what they were worth. Not every woman gets that lucky on the first try. That's exactly why I think it's worth saying all of this out loud, clearly, instead of leaving it wrapped up in the softer, more palatable language of forgiveness and moving on. Forgiveness came for me eventually, and I mean that honestly, but it came after the paperwork, after the settlement, after I'd already secured everything the law said I was owed. It never once came before that, and I don't think it should have. Grace, and now Sam, will grow up in a house built on the actual proceeds of that fight, the business it eventually funded, the stability it eventually purchased. I don't regret, for one single second, insisting on getting that part right before I let myself move on to the softer, more forgiving parts of the story. That's the last thing I have to say about it, I think. Not a moral about love, though there's plenty of that tangled up in here if you want to look for it. Just a plain, unglamorous fact. Know your worth in numbers, not just in feelings, because the people who benefit most from your generosity are rarely the ones who'll ever volunteer to add it up on your behalf. You have to do that part yourself. I did. And it's the single decision from that entire 7 years I've never once regretted making. Some nights I still make that same sweet and sour chicken, though now I make it because Grace asks for it, not because someone else demanded it as tribute for the privilege of sitting at my table. She eats it at our kitchen counter, feet swinging off the stool, telling me some long meandering story about her day, and Sam bangs a spoon against his high chair tray in what I choose to interpret as enthusiastic approval, and Ryan comes in from wherever he's been and steals a piece straight off the pan the way he always does, and I let him, every single time, because it's funnier than it is annoying, and because nobody at this table has ever once made me feel small for feeding them. That's the whole difference in the end, between the life I left and the one I built instead. Not the money, though the money mattered, and I'd never pretend otherwise to make the story sound nobler than it actually was. Not even the courtroom victories, satisfying as they were in the moment. Just this. A kitchen where the food I make is received as a gift instead of a debt, and a family built entirely out of people who showed up because they wanted to, not because blood or paperwork obligated them to. I used to think the hardest part of that whole year was the courtroom, the paperwork, the cold, clinical back and forth over numbers that used to represent 7 years of quiet devotion. Looking back now, I think the hardest part was actually much smaller than that. The 15 seconds it took to say 4 words out loud at a dinner table, after 7 years of silence had convinced me those words weren't mine to say. They were mine the whole time. It just took losing everything else to finally believe it. If there's a version of you reading this who recognizes even a fraction of it, the stove, the silence, the small, constant math of proving your own worth to people who never intended to count it fairly, I hope you find your own 4 words eventually. I hope you don't wait 7 years to say them. And I hope, whenever you finally do, you have a family waiting on the other end of that decision, even if it's a family you haven't built yet. Mine was waiting the whole time, 3 hours upstate, in a house with my childhood bedroom still made up exactly as I'd left it. Yours is out there too, in some shape or another. Go find it. Don't wait for permission from anyone who is never going to give it to you freely in the first place.